Resident Evil 9 is a mixed bag for me. It's a game that's trying to mix what previous entries did while setting up future projects. It doesn't feel unique and different enough to stand on its own. Sure, the game looks phenomenal, and it's fun to play, but then it takes a huge dip in quality towards the back half of the game. And overall, this affects the quality of the entire game. It left me not wanting more of this game, but wanting to go back and play previous titles, because there's moments that are straight lifted from those games. I understand this is common practice, but at the end of the day, when I completed Resident Evil 9, I felt like I just completed a bunch of other games that I've already played. There were shortcuts taken in something that was just so familiar. Sections felt shoehorned in and unnecessary. All of that led me to believe that I was kind of replaying Resident Evil 5 again. A game that was trying to recapture lightning in a bottle from its predecessor. And now before you burn me at the stake, I want to say I've played all 30 Resident Evil games. I have more than like 10,000 hours probably in the entire series. I feel like I'm qualified to speak on the subject. So let's check ourselves into the Rhodes Care Center for an in-depth review of Resident Evil 9 Requiem.
I think I want a second opinion.
Capcom dared to innovate with this game, offering two different perspectives and styles. This approach might excite you about the game's potential to surprise and challenge expectations, all while sparking curiosity and anticipation. But the first thing that I noticed before you even start the game is that Capcom gives you three choices on how you want to play the game for your first playthrough. Easy and normal with autosaves, and then there's this normal classic style that gives you ink ribbons for grace. I think Capcom's intention was to bring us closer to the older days of survival horror, and I chose this difficulty going in. However, when you play as Leon, you get autosaves, which I think is kind of counterintuitive to what the game is trying to do on this difficulty. I think it's a cool idea to have ink ribbons in the game, but not having the feature for the entire game is kind of a letdown, because you can just brute force your way through the Leon sections because of the autosaves. And now in typical Resident Evil fashion, you do have more than enough ink ribbons to make it safe, but as I always do, I imposed a self-challenge to limit my ink ribbons. I ultimately had to break this at certain points because I was desperate. There were points in my first playthrough I couldn't get to where I needed to be because I didn't have enough resources to get through a section. Because one wrong mistake and I had to do it all over again. However, that feeling went away with Leon. You can just run your head through a wall and you'll get through his sections eventually. Grace's section is more of your traditional survival horror aspect, and Leon is what we've come to know in modern action horror games. When you play as Grace, the developers intended you to play as her in first person, and I played this game the way the devs wanted me to. First person can provide you more horror, and for the most part, I think Capcom nailed that. And once again, I think this game was developed with only your first playthrough in mind. The jump scares and horrors don't really last the more you play this game. You and Grace are in the same scenario. You're dealing with the unknown. I think this decision was made to bring us that much closer to the horror. And I do recommend you play your first playthrough in first person. However, for subsequent playthroughs, I kind of enjoy playing in third person more as Grace. That's just a personal preference of mine. But ultimately, I think it would have been better served for Capcom just to focus on one camera perspective. Because we've seen survival horror work in third person and in first person. I don't think really there's much added switching between the two. When you play as Grace, she initially has a limited inventory to her disposal. Initially, she can only carry 8 items, similar to like Ethan in Resident Evil 7. As you proceed through the game, you acquire hit pouches that increase your inventory. This is familiar territory to Resident Evil players. This brings the challenge to the player on what to bring for an expedition between your save points. For my first run, I had no idea what was in store for me, so I always kept the Requiem at my side at all times. Managing your inventory is very important because if you don't know what's next, you don't know what to carry, and I think that's a core Resident Evil aspect, and I think they nailed that in Requiem. With a new character brings a new mechanic in order to deal with the zombies at the Rhodes Care Center. Grace has the ability to pick up the blood in the game with the hemolytic injector. With the hemolytic injector, you can craft every single item in this game, From med injectors to the returning upgrades from Resident Evil 7, steroids, and stabilizers. While crafting is super extensive, I found it somewhat immersion breaking compared to Resident Evil 8. Where the materials made more sense in 8, in 9 they kind of feel weird. For example, crafting a med injection from zombie blood kind of breaks the game a little bit for me. You're trying to heal yourself, it takes you out of that immersion. It doesn't feel right shooting bullets that were crafted with zombie blood. But I think this was done ultimately because the Resident Evil 8 materials didn't store in your inventory, whereas they do in 9. And that would break the inventory system in 9, so I get it, but it's kind of weird. While crafting gives Grace the edge she needs to survive in combat, she can also pick up antique coins throughout the game that allows her to collect upgrades in the parlor akin to bird cages in Resident Evil 7. With all of this at her disposal, Grace becomes formidable enough to take down the pursuers in the care center, and if you do this, you earn special charms that increase her attributes in one way. When it comes to combat, as Grace, you're required to be more stealthy in combat. Rely on your surroundings. In this game, zombies have memories of what they did before they turned, whether it was cleaning blood or following orders to keep the electricity bill down, so utilizing what they are used to doing is fundamental to your success. Running into zombies head-on only leads you to unnecessary damage and probably your death. However, if you are stuck in face-up combat, Grace's skills are limited. She can't parry, nor do devastating melee attacks like Leon. When she staggers an enemy, she has the ability to push them down and run, or to use the injector to make their head explode. Her options really force you to manage your encounters with the resources you have. Do you want to preserve your ammo and injections and push and run? Is this a hallway you're going to have to come back through? All of those are questions you're going to have to answer as Grace, and it makes her gameplay more fun. Outside of combat, you're going to be spending the majority of the early and mid game as Grace. You've been kidnapped by Victor as a key to his plan for his master. Now, this care center is set up like a traditional Resident Evil mansion with the odd puzzle that would make it hard for any patient to get in or out of. However, there's only really one main puzzle type you're going to be solving. They have the same symbols to solve in 3 different locations. And outside of a trip to the basement, her section feels pretty linear, and that really doesn't help with the addition of Leon's campaign. Similar to its contemporary peers, this is a 2-protagonist campaign. When one side is about to peak or climax, you switch over and it gives you kind of a reprieve while changing gameplay. Leon is the veteran bioweapon ass-kicking machine who still manages to keep the same hairstyle for seemingly 30 years. As soon as you're in the shoes of the DSO agent, you're treated to a high-octane run through Renwood. I think this is what fans were hoping for in either 2 or 3 remake, running desperately through the city as the infection is happening. You get initiated early on what Leon is capable of in this game, with his melee attacks and the ability to parry with the hatchet. And Leon is now always fully equipped to use his surroundings, whether it's a chainsaw or through contextual melee attacks. The initial Leon sections of the game are short and have a sort of agency to progress the story, intersecting with Grace's points to conveniently aid in her escape. These short sections make Leon feel rushed, and I don't think that's gonna add much weight to what's going on throughout the game. I also feel like it takes agency away from Grace's section. I think it would have been better served to not even play as Leon early game, similar to like Code Veronica where you take over Chris later in the game. Grace only has one boss fight, and it's kinda underwhelming. And all of Leon's sections feel like they're used from previous games. As both protagonists are now leaving Renwood, Grace alongside Zeno and Victor, and Leon pursuing the trio, you're introduced to Leon's campaign. As you arrive in East Raccoon, you are introduced to the merchant system of the game. Instead of having a human like the merchant in Resident Evil 4 or the Duke in 8, in 9 you get BSAA containers, alongside the tracking module. This feels like something out of the minds of Resident Evil 6. For every kill, you get money through your tracking module. Inherently this is in Resident Evil 4, but the system of former humans dropping their money is more immersive than a kill counter. I kinda hate this mechanic because it broke immersion for me. And then on my second playthrough, I started a new game, but all those containers showed up throughout the care center. And then that leads us to Leon's upgrade system. Visually, this is presented like a COD loadout with sections to upgrade, but they don't feel as impactful as previous entries. After I began to notice, I stopped upgrading. I understand what Capcom was going for here. Players are familiar and have become familiar with merchant systems from the previous 2 entries, but this edition kind of made it feel like it was shoehorned in. On the bright side, you still get to play as Leon Sex Appeal Kennedy. Leon's gameplay is not as good as it is in 4 Remake. It feels tankier because I feel like the game is more tuned for Grace's section than it is balanced to handle both sections. I thought Leon would be a little bit faster than Grace, but I never felt like he was. They both felt tanky and clumsy while controlling. Sure, Leon's movement was more smooth, he wasn't like tripping and falling like Grace does when she's in third person, but outside of that, they felt like they were the same speed, which was kind of weird. Returning is the parry from Resident Evil 4 with Leon's hatchet. The parry this time around though feels more reliant on the player this go around. Instead of 4, you would have it pop up on your HUD of when to parry. In 9, that doesn't happen. You actually need to get the timing down. And I also feel like the window is smaller for the parry, and you don't have as much follow-up options. I tried to focus on the parry when I started to know this to see if I could notice any difference, but at this point my results are kind of inconclusive. Leon can parry almost every single attack in the game, even most of the final boss's attack. And aside from the parry from the hatchet, your weapons also have counter skills. I'm not exactly sure how this triggers, but either way they are cool and it's a killer experience to have, and every time it happens I pop off a little bit because it's pretty awesome. Like I said earlier, Leon's initial sections in the game are very short. You're mostly just chasing after Victor and having the quick boss fight or some room that you gotta clear out to move on to the next section. However, his proper section begins in Raccoon City and the RPD. You'll be spending most of your time in East Raccoon City, and that's kind of set up similarly to Grace's, where you need to find 3 pieces with the additional repair kit throughout the city. I feel like this section is about 30 minutes too long. As fun as the action is and as cool as the setting is, it felt prolonged and repetitive. Run to Beacon, clear out sections of zombies, collect the items, and repeat. As you destroy the gate, Victor is there and you are put into an on-rail section chasing Victor to the RPD. This honestly felt like I was playing Resident Evil 6. We kill some evolved Cerberus and have a game of chicken with Gideon while I audibly yawned. I think Capcom wanted to have a huge action set piece to transition to the next section of the game. However, give us control of the bike. I tested this by setting my controller down, and if it wasn't for the section where the dogs collapse the street sign, I think you'd be able to complete this section without doing anything. I feel like there's just something more we could have done here. And that kind of wraps up Leon's section of the gameplay. We'll discuss more of this later. The next section that I kind of want to talk about is where you play as one of the clones of Grace. It's supposed to feel like a Sherry section of Resident Evil 2, with maybe some influences from the Benevito section of Resident Evil 8. To be honest, I'm not really sure why this section is in here. The game introduces something we never really encounter again, and there's not a whole lot to do in this section. It really just felt like Capcom was trying to hit a bit that scared us the first time we experienced it in Resident Evil 2 Remake, but it doesn't have the same effect that it does in 9. The gameplay comes with a mixed bag for me. I enjoy the Grace sections, but at times I feel like it comes up a bit short. Solving the care center puzzles while taking down the pursuers was thrilling and terrifying, and trying to make sure I was able to handle every encounter as Grace was thrilling. But if we take down all the pursuers and we take over as Leon, there's not much to do in the care center. And then when you get to Leon's main section of the game, it was more of 4 Remake. However, the addition of the upgrades and them not feeling necessary or adding to the game in any way makes that inclusion feel questionable. When Resident Evil 9 was announced and there was no sign of old characters, I was kind of excited. And then Leon's inclusion was rumored and then announced. I was honestly whelmed, to say the least. Not that I don't like Leon, in fact quite the opposite. He was the first person I ever got to play as in Resident Evil, so anytime I get to play as him, I thoroughly enjoy it. But this time it just was different. It's different because of how the game was pitched to us. To use survival horror for one character and high-octane action with Leon. I think it's hard to balance that. It's hard to develop 2 different games that both deliver. And I can say for the most part, I think Capcom did an okay job with both. However, I couldn't help but feel like I was playing DMC4 with Dante. In Devil May Cry 4, the game was only designed with Nero in mind. And then at some point, Capcom forced the development team to put Dante into the game to drive sales. And aside from that, you repeat the sections basically halfway through the game. You start out as Nero, and then you get to a certain point, and then you take over Dante and you go back literally the opposite way you went through the map as Nero and fight the same bosses again. I feel like that's Leon's inclusion in Resident Evil 9. He was kind of put in here to drive sales and drive hype for the game. The game feels incredibly tuned for Grace, so at points, like I said, I begin to question his inclusion. The difficulty in creating two different types of gameplay that can interact with each other and have balance is difficult. But it also kind of creates a problem. Initially, before the game's release, there were people already hating Grace's inclusion because it was slow and tension building and not over the top. Or the loud minority of idiots who are complaining Grace's chest is not big enough or revealing enough. However, the real issue that I have with Leon's inclusion in the game is I feel like Grace doesn't have enough to do. Once you leave the care center, she takes the back seat to the game. I think Capcom dropped the ball here because they could have included her in some sort of boss fight at the end of the game and have more for her to do at the arc. The bright side of Leon's inclusion is I do enjoy the arc that they share. Leon and Grace both feel inadequate in different ways. Grace not being able to save her mom, or Emily, Leon not being able to save everyone that he could. But outside of a selection of a good or a bad ending, Grace doesn't do much in the final act of the game, and her arc falls short of what it could have been. I think if you were to play as Grace in the first section of the Victor fight while Leon is still recovering from the cure, and using more of the hemolytic injectors, I think it would have been good enough, but she just doesn't really appear that much in the third act. And outside of Leon's inclusion in Resident Evil 9, I feel like the game just has a lot of member berries. My initial theories for Resident Evil 9 were most likely we're going to see a lot of the fan service stuff that we didn't see in the remakes or 8, while potentially setting up the future remakes of Code Veronica and 0. In the early game as Leon, you're running through a city in distress as an outbreak is happening, something fans wanted in both the remakes of 2 and 3. I will admit it's a very cool section, but as much as it fits here, why didn't we get this in 2 or 3? And when you take over as Leon in East Raccoon, I really began to feel the nostalgia makeup, the battle at the gas station that is slowly beginning to engulf with flames, similar to Carlos aiding Jill in the original Resident Evil 3. Another thing that came to my attention was the BSAA containers. I feel like there are signs of what to be expected in the Code Veronica remake. The 3D printed puzzle came to mind while I was doing this section. I could see some sort of tracker to earn points to redeem them in Code Veronica that won't set off the metal detector. And another thing that I can't shake is it feels like the final chapter movie. The clones, the evil guys trying to find said clone to unlock the cure. There's even a costume for Grace that is similar to what Alice wears, and it's titled after one of the movies. And we talked about the BSAA containers that feel like it could be in Code Veronica, but there's much more than that. Code Veronica has a huge spider boss. It's a nice callback to an old Resi enemy that we haven't seen in the reimagined era, but it just feels like it's a beta for the remake. I know this is common practice in games, but there's so much of it in 9, it just doesn't stop there. There's also hints of Resident Evil 0. Grace's only boss fight is very similar to the final boss of Resident Evil 0, restoring power to a hatch above that provides sunlight to do damage, and then you deliver the final blow. Like I said, I understand that this is common practice to start testing for future games, but my concerns is how fast we're getting Resident Evil games and how much we are seeing reused mechanics. The next few years could lead to Resident Evil fatigue. Now for all the bad, there are some cool tidbits that we see in the game. The reimagined era finally mentions Barry. It was a bit played up, however I'm still happy to see that inclusion. But there's some characters missing. With Sherry and Leon dealing with Raccoon, I find it's very odd we don't get a Claire mention. Especially after a conversation between Leon and Sherry that was about to get really heavy, reminiscing about that fateful night in 1998. You get to see Tofu as Leon while you're running through the RPD. My first playthrough, I was running around and I kept hearing a noise. In my mind's eye, I knew what it was. However, I couldn't place it, but if I knew it was out there, it had to be in the game. And then all of a sudden I turn the corner and I try to find it and there's Tofu. You can even shoot him and he takes some damage. Nostalgia can be both good and bad. If it's done right, it's something that makes us look fondly upon what we're playing now and reminisce about what was great that came before. If it's done wrong, and we see the blatant ideas that are going to be in future games, that will tire out the fan base and lead to Resident Evil fatigue. After my first playthrough, I kinda wondered what the boss fights in the game were. My initial answer was the Tyrant, Plant 43, and Victor. But someone on my stream kindly pointed out the Spider and Baby were boss fights, alongside the Commander and the final pursuer of the Big Sister. What I'm getting at is the boss fights are, for the most part, forgettable. Which is kinda the reason why we play Resident Evil games. When it comes to the Baby boss fight, I was wondering why this is here. I took it down as Grace. Is it another reused asset? I really couldn't find a file or anything that notes that it's not. And then on my second playthrough, I started to notice something, that the boss fight layouts were kind of similar between the Spider and the Baby. You just have this big square that you run around in and you climb up on a spot, and then you down the boss and you jump off and you hit him with your hatchet. Plant 43 also feels reused, but I can't place it. It's mold-like, but I can't think of anything that feels quite similar to it. But if it's not inherently ripping off anything, it just kind of feels underwhelmed that it's not anything memorable. The Commander fight is basically just the Krauser fight from Resident Evil 4 Remake. However, there's not much of him in this game, so his death is just kind of anticlimactic. The fight itself is kind of played out. It's a close quarters combat boss fight, relying on your parries and strikes. However, unlike the Krauser fight, I was able to take full advantage of my arsenal. Anytime I knocked him down, I threw a grenade and hit him with my SMG, and it made the fight a breeze. And then after that, we have our final boss, Victor. His final form is beat for beat the remake Nemesis fight. And this was such a drag and a letdown, because it's not even a good reused asset. I felt so goofy as Leon, parrying the Nemesis tentacles, or deflecting his rockets before he transformed with my hatchet. This was frustrating because it felt like the design was meant for something snake-like. The coat, the accessories, the snake tongue, it's all tossed aside for something we've seen before. He was actually a menacing nemesis that was intelligent. He could dominate Leon with ease, installing that fear into Leon that he hasn't encountered since Raccoon. And all we get is something that the player has already encountered before. And even Leon is aware of what a nemesis is. Where are the creative juices? A mix with a nemesis virus and a snake-like thing could have been something interesting and awesome, but all we get is something that we've already seen before. Now, I'm not invulnerable to nostalgia. My biggest disappointment was the Tyrant fight. How did we go from something so epic and so climatic like this to this? Tyrants are without a doubt my favorite thing about Resident Evil. I would be so happy if every final boss was just some form of a tyrant. So when I saw Tyrant 501, which I'll just call Mr. X for now because it's easier, I know it's not Mr. X, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to call him X. When I first saw him, I was hype. I thought this was going to be so sick. But then it was just a watered down version of the 2 remake final boss fight. It's so disappointing. I understand the decisions why this happens. It's cost effective, it's gonna drive up sales, but it's lazy. Even for some of the ones that I kinda like, I have to be objective. I really don't like seeing reused boss fights, and all of Leon's encounters are reused boss fights, which really begs the question, was he forced into the game? Resident Evil 9 is a mixed bag for me. It looks amazing, and the first playthrough had some hype moments. It kinda hit that nostalgia drug that I look forward to every time a new Resident Evil game comes out. It's my favorite series, but this one just didn't tickle the way it has in the past. I understand some of the design choices, but we also have unfinished designs with some cool ideas for bosses that ultimately ended up being reused events that we've already experienced. At the end of the day, I really don't like this game. It's not memorable. When I finished this game, it felt like I was driving a used car off the lot. It's something I've already experienced before, and I felt like I didn't need to experience it in a new way. Every single boss fight is something that we've experienced before, and it's cool to see it in its highest fidelity version of Resident Evil 9, but it's not what I was looking for. Resident Evil 9 is a production giant. It looks and sounds great, but sometimes it's hard to hear that OST. And the gameplay as Leon is not as good as it is in 4, and I do enjoy Grace's gameplay. But I feel like a lot of this game is forced. And in the later half of the game, it suffers in quality, it nosedives. And it has some of the series' weakest boss fights due to them being reused. The game tries to balance its survival horror and action. It hits in some areas and it misses in others. For the most part, the mechanics feel good, but it doesn't necessarily feel balanced or tuned properly when you switch between characters. And reusing boss fights that led to them being some of the weakest in the series, I think I'm fine with my 30 hours that I put into the game. I don't really have a need to go back to the game. I wouldn't recommend the game right now. If you're not a huge Resident Evil fan, this game can wait until it goes on sale. But with all of that being said, what do you think of Resident Evil 9? Am I wrong? Do you disagree with me? Let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, click that like and subscribe button for me. We finally hit 100 subscribers, and I want to thank you guys. I know time is a valuable resource that we don't have a lot of, so any amount that you offer to my channel, you have my eternal gratitude. I'll leave you guys with that, and I'll see you in the next video.